1954, Alabama. The small roadside diner smelled of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. The jukebox in the corner hummed a slow blues tune, barely audible over the chatter of the locals. A few truckers sat at the counter, sipping their morning brew. A young waitress in a faded uniform moved between tables, refilling cups with a forced smile. At a small booth near the window, Ezekiel Zeke Carter sat alone, his wrinkled hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. 80 years old, his face was carved with deep lines of wisdom and pain, scars of a lifetime spent fighting wars, both abroad and at home. He had served his country in World War II, putting his life on the line for freedom. But here, in his own homeland, he was treated as less than a man. Zeke exhaled slowly, staring into his cup. The bitter aroma of coffee filled his senses. He had been coming to this diner for years, always sitting in the same corner, always drinking the same black coffee. He never caused trouble, never said much, just existed. But today, trouble had found him. The bell above the diner's door jingled as a group of men walked in, their boots stomping against the floor like an unspoken warning. Billy Ray Calloway, a young white man in his late 20s, broad-shouldered, with a permanent sneer carved onto his face. He had the swagger of a man who had never faced consequences. His family was old Southern money, landowners, cotton barons. His father played golf with the sheriff. His uncle was a judge. Behind him, 3 other men followed, all dressed in denim and work boots, all carrying the same look in their eyes: hatred. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. The waitress stiffened, gripping the coffee pot tighter. A few customers lowered their heads, pretending to be lost in their meals. No one wanted to be caught staring. Billy Ray grinned as he scanned the room, then his eyes landed on Zeke. The grin widened. "Well, well," Billy Ray drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Would you look at that? Old man Carter, sitting here like he owns the place." His gang chuckled. Zeke didn't react. He had learned long ago that men like Billy Ray thrived on attention. Billy Ray took a step forward, dragging a chair from an empty table and spinning it around before dropping into it, straddling it like a cowboy. "You look mighty comfortable, old-timer," he said, resting his arms on the chair's backrest. "Sitting here drinking coffee, acting like you belong." Zeke took a sip, silent. Billy Ray's smile faded. He didn't like being ignored. "You hard of hearing?" he snapped. "Or maybe you're just too stupid to answer." The tension in the diner thickened. A few of the patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one said a word. Billy Ray leaned closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Why don't you go back to Africa, boy?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Zeke froze. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words, but hearing them here, in a place he had been coming to for years, stung differently. Billy Ray's gang snickered. "Maybe he don't speak English," one of them laughed. "Maybe he's just dumb," another added. Billy Ray reached forward and shoved Zeke's coffee off the table. The cup shattered on the floor, the dark liquid splattering across the tiles. The entire diner went silent. Zeke sat still. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was rage. The kind of rage that had been buried for decades. Billy Ray saw the twitch in Zeke's jaw and laughed. "What you gonna do, old man?" he taunted. "You gonna hit me?" He slapped his own cheek mockingly. "Go on, then. Be a man." Zeke's fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. His knuckles turned white. But he didn't move. Because he knew how this played out. He had seen it before. If he fought back, he wouldn't be the one walking out of here. Billy Ray leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You people ain't got no place here," he hissed. And then a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You really want to do this, mate?" The entire diner froze. Slowly, all heads turned towards the corner booth. Jason Statham. He had been sitting there the whole time, silent, watching. His piercing eyes locked onto Billy Ray, his expression unreadable. a man built like a wolf waiting to strike. Billy Ray blinked, caught off guard. "What the hell you just say?" he asked. Jason stood up, slowly, deliberately. His boots scraped against the floor as he took a step forward. He picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, then set it down gently. And then he stared at Billy Ray, unblinking, unfazed, unintimidated. "I said," Jason repeated, his voice calm but edged with something sharp. "You really want to do this, mate?" The air grew heavy. For the first time, Billy Ray didn't laugh. The rest of the diner was deathly silent. All eyes were locked onto Jason Statham, waiting, daring. Billy Ray's jaw clenched, his fingers twitched, his gang shifted nervously behind him. Jason didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Billy Ray Calloway felt something he wasn't used to feeling. But the war in Europe had been different. Out there on the battlefields of World War II, he had faced enemies who wore different uniforms, who shot at him because he was an American soldier. Out there, he had risked his life for a country that had promised him freedom. Yet here, in Alabama, his own home, he was treated as if he didn't belong. Zeke had lived in this town for over 60 years. He had built houses with his bare hands, worked long days under the southern sun, paid his taxes, and never asked for more than what was fair. But to the people here, people like Billy Ray Calloway, none of that mattered. Because to them, he was still just a black man in a white man's town. He had learned to endure, to survive. That was the way things were. Because in this town, justice belonged to the ones who already had power. Born into old money, raised with privilege, and protected by a town that turned a blind eye to his crimes. He had grown up untouchable. His father owned half the farmland in the county. His uncle was a judge. His older brother ran a local business, but everyone knew it was just a front for illegal dealings. And Billy Ray? Billy Ray was the enforcer, a man who had spent his whole life terrorizing anyone who didn't fit his idea of belonging. He had beaten black men in alleys where no one would see, dragged them behind trucks just for looking at white women, set fire to homes knowing damn well the sheriff would call it an accident. No one stopped him, because no one dared. And the ones who did, they disappeared. Now here he was, staring down Jason Statham, a man he didn't recognize, a man who didn't look scared. That was new. Billy Ray didn't like new. The diner was dead silent. The waitress behind the counter held her breath, her hands frozen around the coffee pot. A few customers stole glances, their gazes darting between Billy Ray and Jason Statham. Zeke Carter, still seated at his booth, watched carefully. Because something about this stranger was off. The way he stood, relaxed but not careless, dot. The way he spoke, calm but firm, dot. The way his eyes locked onto Billy Ray, calculating like a man sizing up a fight before it started. Jason wasn't from around here. That much was clear. He didn't have the look of a farmer or a traveling salesman. His clothes were clean but rugged, like a man who had been moving from town to town for a long time. His boots were worn, his knuckles bore faint scars, marks of a man who had seen violence. But the most unsettling thing about him? He wasn't afraid. Billy Ray was used to seeing fear. He fed off it. But this man, he stood there looking at Billy Ray like he was nothing. Billy Ray clenched his jaw. He didn't like that. "You got a problem, stranger?" Billy Ray asked, his voice low. Jason took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. "Not yet," he said. Billy Ray's gang shifted behind him, waiting for a signal. Jason didn't move. He didn't blink, didn't even breathe. The tension in the room was a noose, tightening. Zeke could feel it. He had felt it before, in battle. That moment, right before bullets started flying. He knew what was coming, and he knew one thing for sure. This stranger, Jason Statham, he wasn't here by accident. Billy Ray Calloway was used to people backing down. It was what they did. They avoided his gaze, muttered apologies, and got out of his way. That was how things worked in this town. But this stranger, Jason Statham, wasn't moving. Billy Ray could feel the eyes of the diner on him. The waitress was frozen behind the counter, the customers sitting stiff in their booths, waiting for the explosion they all knew was coming. Zeke Carter hadn't moved either. He had seen this play out too many times before. Billy Ray took a slow step forward, towering over Jason. "You new here, boy?" he asked, his voice coated with false amusement. "I don't recognize you." Jason didn't answer. Billy Ray's smirk faded. "I asked you a question, mate," he said, mocking Jason's accent. Jason finally moved. Not much, just a small tilt of his head as he glanced at Billy Ray's hands. Zeke noticed it immediately. Jason was assessing, calculating. The way a fighter does before a punch is thrown. Billy Ray's gang inched closer, smelling a fight. One of them, a wiry man with bad teeth, leaned in. "Come on, Billy. Show him how we handle outsiders." Billy Ray grinned again. "You see," he said, turning to Jason, "you might be new here, but we got a way of doing things. You walk in, you show respect, and if you don't," he lunged. The movement was fast, sloppy, pure aggression with no control. Jason sidestepped easily. Billy Ray's fist cut through empty air, throwing him off balance. Jason, still calm, lifted his coffee cup and took a sip. Billy Ray's face turned red. The diner gasped. Zeke's grip tightened around his cane. This wasn't going to end well. Billy Ray snapped. "Boy, I'm gonna—" The door slammed open. Sheriff Clayton Pierce had arrived, and he wasn't alone. Two deputies followed, hands resting on their gun belts. The moment Billy Ray saw the sheriff, his scowl turned into a smirk, because now he had already won. Sheriff Pierce was a walking symbol of everything wrong in this town. A man who had never lifted a finger against the powerful. A man who never saw a crime when Billy Ray was the one committing it. He looked around the diner, then at Billy Ray. "Something going on here, boys." Billy Ray dusted off his shirt, still grinning. "Just teaching some manners, Sheriff." Pierce's eyes landed on Jason, cold, calculating. Then on Zeke, still sitting in his booth, dismissive. "That right?" the sheriff asked. Jason stayed silent. Pierce's expression darkened. He hated outsiders, hated people who didn't fall in line. Billy Ray spread his arms. This man, he pointed at Jason, was causing trouble, stirring folks up. Pierce didn't even hesitate. "Well then," the sheriff said, resting a hand on his holster, "guess we better take care of that." Jason narrowed his eyes. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but deadly cold. "This man attacked me, and you're arresting me?" Pierce smirked. "You got it, boy." Billy Ray chuckled. Zeke sighed. He had known this was coming. The moment he had seen the sheriff walk in, there was only one way this was going to end. Jason had stepped into a game that had been rigged long before he ever arrived. One of the deputies moved toward Jason. "Hands behind your back." Jason didn't move. For a second, Zeke thought he might resist, that he might fight his way out of it. But Jason wasn't stupid. This wasn't just about him. His eyes flicked to Zeke. He knew the old man would get caught in the crossfire if things turned ugly. And so, Jason slowly raised his hands. The metal of the cuffs was cold against his wrists. Billy Ray clapped his hands together, grinning like a wolf. Zeke pushed himself up from the booth, shaking his head. "This is wrong," he muttered. Pierce turned his dead-eyed stare on Zeke. "You got something to say, old man?" Zeke clenched his jaw. He had spent his whole life knowing that if you spoke up in this town, you suffered for it. But something about this moment, about seeing Jason getting shackled, about watching Billy Ray grin like he had won, lit a fire inside him. So Zeke lifted his chin. "You're a coward," he said. The diner went dead silent. For the first time, Pierce actually looked angry. His expression darkened, and he took a slow step forward. "That's so?" he asked, his voice dripping with quiet menace. You heard me, Zeke said. His voice didn't waver. Pierce nodded slowly. Well then, I guess you can come along too. Zeke didn't flinch as the deputy grabbed his arm and snapped the cuffs around his wrists. Billy Ray let out a long, satisfied exhale. Don't go too hard on him, Sheriff, he laughed. We wouldn't want him breaking too fast. The officers dragged Jason and Zeke toward the door. As Jason passed Billy Ray, the racist thug leaned in close and whispered, Welcome to town, boy. Jason didn't even blink. He just smiled, because this wasn't over. The jail cell smelled of rust and old sweat. The single overhead light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the cold brick walls. Jason sat on the hard wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees, his jaw tight with frustration. He had been in worse situations before, but this felt different, not because of the danger, but because of the sheer injustice of it. Across from him, Zeke Carter sat silently, his aged hands clasped together, his face unreadable. The old man hadn't said much since they were locked up. Jason studied him. The deep wrinkles on Zeke's face weren't just from age. They were from years of carrying a burden too heavy to bear. Finally, Jason broke the silence. You gonna tell me why that bastard hates you so much? Zeke exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Son, this ain't about me. It's about all of us. Jason frowned. Zeke leaned forward, his dark eyes steady. I fought in a war, he said. Wikutu, enlisted when I was 18, fought for this country. Nearly died for it. Jason didn't say anything. He just listened. When the war ended, Zeke continued, the white soldiers came home as heroes. They got their parades, their job offers, their fresh starts. He paused, his voice tightening. But the black soldiers? We came home to the same hate we left behind. Jason clenched his fists. He had seen injustice in his time, but hearing it firsthand made it hit harder. They wouldn't even let me eat at the same diners I bled for, Zeke said, his voice low but filled with decades of restrained anger. And when I tried to build a life for myself, they burned it down. Jason leaned forward. Who? Zeke let out a bitter laugh. Who do you think? Jason already knew the answer. Billy Ray's father. The Callaways had been tormenting Zeke for decades, stealing his land, beating him down, making sure he stayed beneath them. And the sheriff? Jason asked. Zeke's expression hardened. Pierce's daddy was sheriff before him. The same hands that locked me up today are the same hands that beat my brother to death when I was a boy. Jason's jaw tensed. This wasn't just corruption. This was generations of cruelty. Zeke sighed. I fought for this country, but this country never fought for me. The metallic clank of the jailhouse door opening broke the silence. A woman's voice echoed down the hallway. I need to speak to your prisoners. Jason looked up. A woman with sharp eyes and confidence in her stride walked toward the cell. Dark red lipstick, a black notebook clutched in her hands. The deputy scoffed. Ain't no visitors allowed, missy. The woman didn't flinch. You know who I am? She asked, arching an eyebrow. The deputy hesitated. Jason smirked. She had power. Zeke, however, looked surprised. Sarah? The woman turned toward him, her expression softening. It's been a long time, Zeke. Jason glanced between them. Zeke shook his head, almost in disbelief. Sarah Bennett. Thought you'd left this town for good. She nodded. I did, but I came back when I heard what happened. Jason leaned against the bars. And what exactly did you hear? Sarah looked at him. That the sheriff locked up the wrong men. The deputy scowled. You don't got no business here, lady. The sheriff said. Sarah cut him off. The sheriff doesn't scare me. She pulled a folded document from her bag and slammed it against the bars. Jason caught a glimpse. A court order. Zeke frowned. What is that? Sarah smiled slightly. It's a thorn in their side. Jason took the paper and read quickly. You got a federal judge to intervene? Sarah nodded. Sheriff Pierce isn't as untouchable as he thinks. This isn't 1850. He still has to answer to someone. The deputy gritted his teeth. I gotta call the sheriff. Yeah, Sarah said, folding her arms. You do that. 15 minutes later, Sheriff Pierce arrived, seething. His cold eyes scanned Sarah with pure hatred, but he knew he couldn't ignore a direct court order. He grabbed his keys and unlocked the cell. Statham, get out. Jason didn't move. He looked at Zeke. What about him? Pierce smirked. Court order only mentions you. Jason turned to Sarah. You can't get him out? Sarah's jaw tightened. Not yet. Zeke gave Jason a sad smile. Ain't your fight, son. Jason took a deep breath, then stepped out of the cell. As he passed the sheriff, he held his stare. You know this ain't over, right? Pierce's smirk widened. Jason stepped out of the sheriff's office, his fist clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of tobacco and cheap beer lingering in the streets. He could still feel Sheriff Pierce's smug gaze on his back, that damn smirk like he had already won. Jason knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. As he walked toward the boarding house where he was staying, he noticed something. A group of men gathered near the general store, speaking in hushed voices. He recognized a few of them. Billy Ray's gang. Jason narrowed his eyes and slowed his steps, sticking to the shadows. He positioned himself behind a wooden post and listened. Midnight, one of them whispered. Sheriff's gonna look the other way. Billy Ray's voice cut through the night like a blade. Old bastard's been running his mouth too long. Time to remind him his place. Jason's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what they were planning. A lynching. They weren't just going to keep Zeke locked up. They were going to kill him. Jason's breath came slow and steady, but inside a storm raged. He had been in life or death situations before. He had seen men do horrible things. But this was something else. He had a choice. Walk away, or do something about it. He already knew his answer. Jason moved fast. He needed allies. He stormed into Sarah Bennett's small office where she was reviewing legal papers under the dim glow of a lantern. We got a problem, Jason said, his voice sharp. Sarah looked up, startled. What is it? Jason leaned over the desk. Billy Ray and his men. They're gonna lynch Zeke tonight. Sarah's face went pale. Are you sure? Jason's jaw tightened. They weren't exactly whispering. Sarah stood up, grabbing her coat. We have to stop them. Jason watched her. You really think anyone in this town is going to help? Sarah hesitated, and Jason saw it in her eyes. Fear. She knew the truth. This town had already decided where it stood. The sheriff? Corrupt Dot? The law? Non-existent Dot. The townsfolk? Silent. Jason ran a hand over his face. We're on our own. Sarah swallowed hard. Then we better move fast. Inside the jail, Zeke Carter lay on the cold floor, barely breathing. The attack had been swift, brutal, and carried out with surgical precision. Billy Ray's men had beaten him bloody, then left him to die. Sheriff Pierce had conveniently stepped out when it happened. Zeke tried to move, but pain shot through his ribs. Broken. He coughed, and something warm dripped from his lips. Blood. He could hear them outside the cell, laughing. He won't last till midnight, one of them said. Doesn't matter, Billy Ray sneered. We'll string him up anyway. Let the whole town see. Zeke closed his eyes. He had survived war, racism, and a lifetime of pain. But now, he wasn't sure if he'd make it through the night. Jason and Sarah arrived at the jailhouse just as Billy Ray's men started gathering. The noose was already being tied. Jason saw red. He wasn't just going to stop them, he was going to make them pay. Sarah grabbed his arm. Jason, think this through. Jason shook her off. I've thought enough. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward the gang. No fear, no hesitation. Billy Ray turned, grinning. Well, well, look who's back. Jason stopped a few feet away. His eyes locked onto Billy Ray's. You're not touching him, Jason said, his voice low and deadly. Billy Ray laughed. That's so? Jason cracked his neck. Yeah. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Billy Ray's grin widened. You must be real stupid, mister. Jason didn't blink. And you must be real soft. The smile faded. Billy Ray's eyes darkened. You don't know what you're messing with. Jason took a step closer. Neither do you. The fight was about to begin. Jason Statham stood outside the diner, the neon lights flickering above him. The town was quiet, too quiet. He wasn't just walking into a fight. He was walking into war. His knuckles were wrapped, his stance calm but lethal. Inside that diner sat Billy Ray Calloway and his gang, laughing, drinking, celebrating. They thought they had won. They thought Jason had left town, just another outsider who knew better than to stand up to them. They were dead wrong. Jason took a deep breath. Then, he stepped inside. The moment Jason walked through the door, the room fell silent. Billy Ray, lounging at a booth with his boots on the table, looked up, his grin slowly fading. His gang, 6 men, all of them armed, all of them cocky, stiffened. Jason let the door swing shut behind him. He rolled his shoulders, his voice cold as steel. I warned you, Billy Ray chuckled, shaking his head. You just don't know when to quit, do you? Jason took another step forward. Oh, I know when to quit. I just ain't done yet. Billy Ray smirked, looking around at his men. You really think you can take all of us? Jason exhaled slowly. I don't think. I know. And then all hell broke loose. First strike. Jason moved like lightning, his fist slamming into the nearest thug's jaw. A sickening crack echoed as the man dropped, unconscious, before he hit the floor. Second attack. Another thug lunged, swinging a bottle. Jason ducked, grabbed his arm and twisted. A scream tore through the diner as the man's shoulders snapped out of place. Third and fourth. 2 more rushed at him. Jason grabbed one by the collar and used his momentum to slam him straight through a table. The other got a brutal elbow to the ribs, followed by a knee to the face. The diners exploded into chaos. Chairs crashed, glass shattered, people ran for cover. Billy Ray backed up, his cocky grin gone. You son of a... Jason didn't let him finish. He grabbed Billy by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the wall. Billy gasped, struggling. You're dead, you hear me? The sheriff's gonna... Jason punched him in the gut, hard. Billy choked, his knees buckling. The sheriff? Jason growled. You mean the one who let you get away with murder? Billy spat blood. That's right. Ain't no one gonna stop me. Jason grabbed him by the hair, forcing him to look up. Wrong. Right on cue, the diner doors swung open. Sheriff Pierce stepped in, flanked by 2 deputies. He saw the carnage, his boys bleeding, broken. His face twisted with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing? Jason released Billy, letting him crumple to the floor. Sheriff Pierce pulled his gun. I should have put you down the second you set foot in this town. Jason didn't even flinch. You gonna shoot me? He asked, voice calm. In front of all these witnesses? The sheriff's hand twitched. Jason smirked. Go ahead, pull the trigger. Let the world see who you really are. A camera clicked. Sheriff Pierce turned. Sarah Bennett stood at the door, holding a camera, her face hard with determination. You're done, Sheriff, she said. The world is gonna know everything. Billy Ray coughed, looking up. What the hell is she talking about? Sarah stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. Testimonies, evidence, proof that you and the sheriff have been covering up crimes for years. Beatings, murders, lynchings. She threw the papers on the counter. It's over, Jason smiled. Looks like your luck ran out, boys. The sound of sirens filled the air. Not local cops, FBI. The diner doors burst open, and federal agents flooded in. Drop your weapons, one of them barked. Sheriff Pierce froze. Now, hold on a damn minute. The lead agent cut him off. We've got enough evidence to put you away for life, Sheriff. Billy Ray panicked. This is a mistake. You can't do this. Jason knelt beside him, his voice low. You tried to kill an old man. You've been killing for years. But guess what? He leaned in closer. You finally picked the wrong fight. Billy Ray's face drained of color. The sheriff and his men were hauled to their feet, handcuffed, dragged out of the diner. The town had protected them for years. But not anymore. Zeke sat on the hospital bed, bandages covering his face. He looked up as Jason walked in. You made it, Jason said. Zeke chuckled weakly. Guess I'm too damn stubborn to die. Jason sat beside him. Billy Ray and the sheriff are done. The feds are taking over. Zeke exhaled slowly. Took long enough. Jason nodded. Yeah, but it's done. Zeke stared at him. Why'd you do it, son? Jason thought for a moment. Then he shrugged. Because somebody had to. Zeke smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he thought he'd never feel again. Antiseptic and fading hope. The walls were dull, the lighting harsh, but Ezekiel Zeke Carter had seen worse. He sat up slowly, his ribs aching, his body weak. But he was alive. That was more than Billy Ray and his men had planned for him. When Jason stepped into the room, Zeke turned his head, his weary eyes locking onto him. You came back, Zeke muttered. Jason pulled up a chair beside the bed, resting his forearms on his knees. Yeah, didn't feel right leaving without checking on you. Zeke smirked. Didn't figure you for the sentimental type. Jason shrugged. Neither did I. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything hanging between them. You did it, Zeke finally said. Billy Ray, the sheriff. They're done. Jason nodded. Yeah, but it don't change what they did to you. Zeke exhaled, looking down at his hands. They trembled slightly. His body was battered, and the doctors had told him the damage was permanent. His leg would never fully heal. The beating had left scars inside and out. They took a lot from me, Zeke admitted, but they didn't take everything. Jason studied him. You sure about that? Zeke chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I used to be a soldier. Thought I'd be fighting for something bigger than myself. Thought this country gave a damn about men like me. Jason didn't speak. He let Zeke say what needed to be said. But I learned something a long time ago, Zeke continued, his voice quieter now. This country don't fight for us. We gotta fight for ourselves. Jason clenched his jaw. Maybe, but that don't mean you gotta fight alone. Zeke looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, there was something close to gratitude in his tired eyes. Guess not, Zeke murmured. Outside, the town was changing, whether it wanted to or not. The news had spread like wildfire. The journalist, Sarah Bennett, had done her job well. The world knew now. There was no more hiding behind silence. No more pretending that justice existed when it didn't. Billy Ray Calloway and Sheriff Pierce had been arrested. The sheriff had screamed about a setup, had sworn he'd beat the charges, but the FBI wasn't letting him go this time. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had come forward, people who had been too afraid before. Billy Ray, on the other hand, had gone quiet. Jason had seen the fear in his eyes when they dragged him out of the diner. He had ruled this town through violence and intimidation, but now he was just another criminal in cuffs, another coward who had finally lost control. But the arrest of two men wouldn't erase the years of hate that had rotted this place from the inside out. Racism wasn't just in the sheriff's office. It was in the stares of the townsfolk who had looked the other way. It was in the whispers that had kept Zeke alone for so many years. It was in the silence. And silence, Jason knew, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Jason walked out of the hospital, the sun hanging low in the sky. He could have stayed. He could have watched the trials unfold, seen justice all the way through. But this wasn't his town. His work here was done. Sarah met him outside, leaning against her car. You really leaving? Jason nodded. Yeah. She crossed her arms, studying him. You could stick around. People here need someone like you. Jason exhaled. People like me don't belong in places like this. Sarah scoffed. You just changed this whole damn town, and you don't think you belong here? Jason looked back at the hospital window, where Zeke sat watching the world outside. I did what needed doing, Jason said. But this fight, it ain't over. It never was. Sarah sighed. So what now? You just disappear? Jason shrugged. Something like that. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, if you ever change your mind. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, scribbled something down, and tore the page out. My number, just in case. Jason took it, folding it neatly before sliding it into his pocket. Sarah looked up at him. You're a good man, Jason. Jason smirked. That right? She smiled. Yeah, but you already knew that. Jason didn't answer. He just turned, walking toward his car. As he climbed in, he cast one last glance at the town, the people, the buildings, the ghosts. Then without another word, he started the engine and drove away. Zeke watched Jason's car disappear down the road. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. You think he'll come back? She asked. Zeke smirked. Nah, he ain't the type. Sarah nodded. Still, he did something real here, you know. Zeke exhaled. Yeah, but the real question is, what do we do now? Sarah looked around at the town, the same town that had ignored injustice for so long. That's up to us, she said. Zeke nodded. Damn right it is. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant voices, people talking,